3 titik yang ada di pojok kanan bawah, lalu pilih language interpretation. Setelah pilih language interpretation, silahkan pilih bahasa yang ingin Anda dengarkan. Lalu setelah itu jangan lupa untuk klik tulisan done agar Anda bisa langsung mendengarkan interpretasi dari juru bahasa kami. If you are using mobile phone, you will see a little bit different interface. Like in the left side of your screen, you have to click the 3 dots on the bottom side of your Zoom interface in your mobile phone, and then click language interpretation, and then choose your preferred language. After you choose your preferred language, don't forget to click done, because when you're not click done yet, you will not listen to our interpretation channel. So you have to click done after you choose your preferred language. Jadi kurang lebih seperti itu cara menggunakan fitur juru bahasa kami. Saya mengucapkan selamat menjalankan webinar ini dengan lancar, dan saya serahkan kembali ke moderator acara. Terima kasih, thank you, and good afternoon.
Yeah, thank you, Bahasa Global Team. So, selamat siang semuanya. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Race to Zero Dialogues webinars. This webinar is hosted by the British Embassy Jakarta in cooperation with British Chamber of Commerce. So we're delighted to host these events as we hope that this will encourage Indonesian businesses, cities, investors, universities, and NGOs to engage, join the global initiative, and commit to achieve net zero emissions. This webinar will be divided into sessions. In the first session, we will have a presentation from Alex Howe from the COP26 unit of the Cabinet Office, and Bridget Jackson from the High-Level Climate Action Champion, who will present the importance of businesses' participation in tackling climate change and how you can all register in the global initiative. In the second session, we will have senior representatives from prominent business sector in Indonesia, such as PT Unilever Indonesia, PT Indika Energy, Standard Chartered Bank, and Forest Carbon. They will present the action that they have been doing by their companies towards the global low carbon transition that will hopefully encourage other companies to take similar part and achieve the same goal. Each session will be followed by a Q&A sessions. Participants can direct all questions to all panelists in the Q&A box in English or in Bahasa Indonesia, but we can help translate it. So without further ado, we would like to invite Her Majesty Ambassador for Indonesia in Timor Leste, Mr. Owen Jenskins, to give an opening remarks. Pak Owen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mbak Atika, and welcome everybody to this excellent and important webinar on the Race to Zero. Let me express a particular welcome to Ibu Sherry Nur Salim, the Special Advisor on Climate Change to His Excellency, the Coordinating Minister for Maritime and Investment Affairs. Let me express my gratitude also to Pak Ainsley Mann of Swire for coordinating this event and for moderating the sessions later. It's great to have some really excellent panels. Mbak Atika has already mentioned Alex Howe and Bridget Jackson, who will be talking us through the Race to Zero. And I'm very grateful to colleagues from companies who are very committed on this agenda for forming our panel later. So Bapak Arif Hudaya, Chief Financial Officer at PT Unilever, Bapak Rino Donasuputri, Vice Chairman, ASEAN and President Commissioner, Standard Chartered Bank, Jeffrey Chatelier, Managing Director, Forest Carbon, and Bapak Asjad Rasjid, President Director, PT Indika Energy. Thank you all very much for giving up your time for today's event. And I hope that one of the things that we'll be seeing from what we talk about today is how the shift to a zero carbon future is already underway. This is not something which is in the future. This is something which is happening now and is happening more quickly than many people expected. It's also creating good jobs. This is something which is driving economic growth in a whole range of areas. That growth is sustainable, it builds resilience into economies, and it also can help protect people's health as well as building a better future for us all by combating dangerous climate change. And as this global transition accelerates, it's very clear how critical the role of business is in taking forward this change. Business will lead in a whole range of areas. It will be able to demonstrate the feasibility and desirability of progress. It will innovate to create the new technologies, products, and business models that we need to drive a low carbon future. And it will invest to make sure that business and society are taking advantage of those opportunities. And as I said, that's already happening. And we see that in the commitments which have been made to net zero. So over 1/5 of the world's 2,000 largest companies have already made a net zero commitment. 73 asset managers, who between them represent over $32 trillion in assets, have done the same. And those huge companies and huge investment managers have done this because they recognize the opportunities and benefits which are available to business from the low carbon transition. The global market for goods and services in low carbon is estimated at $5.5 trillion. And one only has to look at the share price of Tesla and its comparison with established automobile makers to see quite how quickly value can be created in a company which a few years ago was small, is now worth more than the 9 biggest established automobile makers combined. So business action is vitally important to achieving the global transition. And it's also critical to the climate summit, which the United Kingdom will host later this year, COP26. We want to be as inclusive as we can be as we move towards COP26 and bring together not just governments, but business leaders, researchers, experts, civil society, and young people to ensure that we are bringing all of the sectors who need to be involved into one place to drive a better future for all of us. And we want to see companies from around the world combining to take this forward. And that's where today's event and the theme of today's event really comes in. So Race to Zero, which you will hear more about later, is a global campaign to rally leadership and support from businesses, but also from cities, investors, regions, universities, and others to mobilize a coalition which can lead the net zero transition. This race already represents 471 cities, 23 regions, 1,675 businesses, 85 of the biggest investors, and so on. These real economy actors are engaging themselves with what is genuinely a race now to move to net zero as quickly as we can. In this webinar, we will be hearing about Race to Zero, but we'll also be encouraging all of you on the line to get involved. Some Indonesian companies have already committed themselves to the Race to Zero and to net zero, and that's tremendously welcome. But we would like to see more getting involved, and we'd be happy to work with them as we move towards COP26 to make the commitments which will really make the transition possible. So through today's webinar, we want not only to talk about what Race to Zero is, but also encourage those who aren't already involved to get involved and to start a multi-party dialogue about what we need to do and the concrete actions we need to take in order to achieve it. This will be followed up by an ASEAN Race to Zero event on the 24th and 25th of May, and I hope that as many as possible will also be able to join that. So this is a fantastic opportunity. I'm so glad that with BritCham, the British Embassy is taking this forward. And I hope that today's webinar goes extremely well and encourages more action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pak Owen. For the second opening remarks, I would like to invite Ibu Cherry Nur Salim, the Special Advisor on Climate to the Coordinating Minister for Maritime and Investment. Ibu Cherry Nur Salim, over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Owen Jenkins, for hosting this timely webinar, and also for Ainsley for moderating. It's an honor to be among the distinguished speakers and participants who care for our better business, better world. So last Thursday, President Jokowi joined 40 heads of state in this historic climate leaders summit, which was held within 100 days of the Biden's administration. I think next slide, you could see our InterMinisterial task force were there, I think as the summit was going on. And in the middle, you see, next slide, Ibu Siti, who is our minister, who is in charge of the NDC, who I think together with the task forces were diligently led by sort of different ministries, and they were diligently monitoring what are the other countries doing, what are the technical aspects and methodologies, including the breakouts. There's working groups. So our government has been actually following this. Next slide. You can see this actually started when Special Envoy John Kerry reached out, and we had a meeting, and it was in that meeting that I think I was appointed as the special advisor on the climate to follow investments and also the international liaisons. Next slide. You see that we have since then also held many Indonesia, US climate task forces meetings, I think led by Ibu Ami, Parwanda, Luki from finance, and also Dadan from the energy ministry. So the cross ministerials with Bapenas, with many other ministries involved. And this is one of the meetings, the Trihita Karana Climate Dialogues for the task forces, where our Minister of Energy, Pak Arifin, spoke at. Next slide. We are very thankful that in the road to COP26 that you have invited Coordinating Minister Arlanga to co-chair for the FACT dialogue. And I understand actually he also have already had one big meetings with the different countries. And next we have Ibu Sri Mulyani, who is also elected as the co-chair of the Finance Ministers Coalition on Climate Action. So Indonesia is actually, the governments are really well positioned and very conscientious, is working towards this climate ambition. Next slide. There is a challenge. I think this is a report from Bapenas. There is even from the current ambition to meet a higher ambition of 41% by 2030. There is an annual shortfall funding gap of around 19 billion. Depending if we have more of the stimulus, it would reduce to 13 billion, but it's still a big number. And we are, I think, under the President Jokowi as the honorary patron, we have set up the Trihita Karana Forum that during the World Bank IMF meetings, I think held forum on blended finance for better business, better world. And at that time, we mobilized about $10 billion to support SDGs. And next slide, I think the Indonesia government is looking to do the same for meeting our climate challenge. Next slide. So this is a slide by SMI under the Finance Ministry. So SMI is led by Pa Edwin and team, and they have been one of the highlights. I think Indonesia was the first country to launch the Blended Finance Fund in the world, and they mobilized $3 billion. And over the COVID year last year, they have implemented 15 projects, about $791 million. And they're all linked to green investments and infrastructures. And so under the THK, Trihita Karana platform, we also have many UK International Council members. So I think you're familiar with maybe Paul Polman, Locke Niston, Jeremy Oppenheim. They're among the councils together with the International Chambers of Commerce, World Bank, World Economic Forum, OECD, WRI, JAF, UNSDSN, and others. Next slide. I think we appreciate, maybe before that, I just want to say we really congratulate also for the Glasgow Alliance, a financial alliance for net zero. And we do want to connect with this alliance in order to work together with our global Indonesia aspiration to found the Global Blended Finance Institute next year in Bali around the G20. So I think I think the ambassador, you have talked about jobs, and you have talked about the planetary health, and I think that indeed, you know, a lot of this can only be achieved if we work together. And it's not just about finance, it's not just about technology. Of course, those are really important, but it's also about capacity building and people to people. So I just want to raise, like, you know, in closing, because I only have 5 minutes, so I just want to raise that we would, there are areas that we have already worked on, such as this one is the U Lab. We work with that. Otto Sharma, who has developed this process that is quite global now. And we work, I think at one time you can have 1 sessions with thousands of people joining and solving climate issues at the same time. So this is the Gaia journey. We have the ideas journey and others. Next slide. We just want to show, this is, I think the Indonesia has, I think President Jokowi has shared how, you know, we have perhaps championed in the forest aspect, in the only country in the world that have reduced deforestation for 4 years in a row. And I think the social forestry law is one where we also respect the indigenous communities. And this is where I think we're also very proud. One of the Bekal programs is Indigenous Leaders program to work with capacity with the stewards of our planet. So I think next slide is another one on Bahasa Bali. It's sort of a program of initiated by women who cared about Indonesia and cared about the cultures. And they, I think our foundation initiated, supported this deck on environment, and they have a lot of activities from all over the Bali and using the Balinese language also. And so I think we just want to thank you for doing this Race to Zero, for doing COP. I think UK has led by example too, and Indonesia would like to lead by example too. So the Race to Zero is also a race to save humanity. And it is also a race to value. There was a report just came out yesterday, I think on the Swiss Re, or maybe just this weekend, that showed the countries that actually, if we do not work on the climate solution, the countries that do not support it, in fact, our economies are going to shrink. And the largest beneficiaries, if we were to work on climate, is ASEAN. I think the numbers were like about 25% of our economic growth or loss if we don't you know, address this. And Indonesia has, in fact, among the countries listed, the highest economic value on the climate. So I think we have the most value to gain, but we have to really work with the businesses, and there are solutions. As we have demonstrated on the forest, but we have to work on the energy side, you know, that we're looking at the carbon markets, the renewable bill, and energy waste, many other transportation. So there's a whole suite of areas where there are also economic opportunities. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Ibu Cherry. It is great to see climate initiative being implemented globally and in Indonesia, and hopefully it will keep growing as climate crisis is an urgent issue to be tackled. So we now come to the discussion sessions. There are 2 sessions that will be moderated by Ainsley Mann. He is the Asian Head of Business Development at Aspire Pacific, the Trade Envoy for Indonesia from the Scottish Government, and also the former Chairman of Britam Indonesia. Ainsley, over to you.
Thank you very much, Indika. Thank you very much, Ambassador Jenkins, and also thank you to Cherie. It's really great to see the UK government and the Indonesian government senior officials playing such a prominent role now in this Race to Zero dialogue. And I think Cherie's presentation was particularly important, because what it does is it highlights that there is an awful lot of good work going on in Indonesia, and sometimes that message is not necessarily understood overseas. I would also like to take this opportunity to commend Cherie for all the work she's done over a very, very long period of time to advance the climate change related agenda here in Indonesia. And that includes, but not limited to, the sterling work that the Trihita Karana Forum does in bringing together thought leaders from government, business and academia. And I've certainly benefited from joining some of these events and forums. Now, to continue the theme of government and business engagement, it's my pleasure to introduce two members of the COP26 delegation who can hopefully explain more about the role of business in COP26, how businesses can get involved, and how they can expect to gain from the experience. This segment, it should take around about 15 to 20 minutes maximum. Hopefully there'll be a time for Q&A. If we're running out of time, I can assure you that all questions will be logged and a response given to everyone that submits a question. So our two panelists in this section are as follows. Firstly, Alex Howe. Alex is part of the COP26 unit in the UK Cabinet Office, which has been set up to deliver COP26 and is one of the business engagement leads. Prior to this, Alex worked in the International Climate Change Strategy in the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, including as part of the team that successfully bid for the UK to host COP26. Before joining the UK civil service, Alex worked in the private sector as an environmental advisor to an energy company. Immediately following Alex's presentation will be one from Bridget Jackson. Bridget is the business engagement lead at the United Nations High-Level Climate Champions team, whose role is to engage non-state actors in climate action via the Race to Zero Breakthrough, and the Race to Resilience campaigns ahead of COP26 summit. She has also been the Chief Sustainability Officer at PwC in the UK since 2010, overseeing a 60% reduction in Scope 1, 2 and 3 absolute greenhouse emissions between 2007 to 2020, and architecting the global PwC network Net Zero by 2030 commitment, which was launched last year. So in the interest of time, I would now like to hand over to Alex.
Great, thank you very much, Ainsley, and thanks very much as well to the embassy for putting this great event together, and to all of the businesses for attending as well. I'm just going to share my screen, if possible. I don't seem to be able to share my screen, but perhaps I think I shared the slides in advance. So if one of my colleagues in the embassy might be able to, that would be brilliant. But perhaps while we get that sorted, I thought I would just kick off by talking through some of the overall objectives for COP26, and then we can go into a bit of detail about how businesses can get involved and support those. So there are four. Thank you. So I think we've got the slides up on screen now, and if we could just go to the next one, please. So there are four main objectives for COP26. The first is to put the world on a path to reach net zero by the middle of the century, which is really essential for keeping the 1.5 degree goal that was agreed in Paris within reach. What we also know is that today's targets for 2030 globally are nowhere near enough to get us there, as recent reports from the UN and others have made very clear. So a key priority of the UK this year is to urge all countries to set 2030 emission reduction targets that get us closer to that goal. The second aim is adaptation. We are already seeing the destructive impacts of climate change from across the world, which particularly impacts some specific vulnerable countries, but also vulnerable communities as well. So protecting those communities and natural habitats is another of our priorities. Third aim is around finance. Sufficient funds are obviously key to tackling the climate crisis. We estimate that $3.5 trillion of investment by 2030 in developing countries is needed to enable climate action in line with the Paris Agreement. Developed countries have also promised to raise $100 billion a year for climate action as part of the goals of the Paris Agreement. And on private finances, we've touched on a couple of things already with the launch of the GLAW Alliance, but there's mobilizing more private finances is a key part of that goal as well. And the fourth aim is around improving global collaboration around specific key issues, particularly to make the negotiations a success. But we also want to bring communities, governments, businesses, civil society organizations together to accelerate the global move to net zero, and particularly around 5 specific areas. And if we go on to the next slide, that kind of sets out these areas where we think we need more collaboration. And these are the sort of the 5 campaigns. So adaptation and resilience, so helping communities better prepare for the impact of climate change, energy transition, embracing the clean growth opportunities, and accelerating the transition from coal to green energy, finance, bringing about a transformation of the financial system, nature, protecting and restoring natural habitats and ecosystems through nature-based solutions, and transport with a particular focus on speeding up the phase out of petrol and diesel vehicles, and supporting the transition to zero emission vehicles. So there's an absolutely key role for businesses to play in all of these. And as has already been touched on, a kind of accelerating momentum in the private sector towards net zero and in some of these areas. And we very much appreciate the support that a lot of the businesses here have already lended to some of these areas. We're also seeing a kind of increasing interest from investors, consumers, and other stakeholders who are kind of increasingly keen to see the action that businesses are taking and ensure that is kind of done in a robust and ambitious way. And in order to kind of ensure that is being done, that's one of the key reasons we're calling on businesses to join the race to zero in the build up to COP26. And Bridget after me is going to go into a bit more detail on what the race to zero actually is. But the reason that we like it and support it is because it not only requires businesses to commit to net zero by 2050 at the latest, but also requires them to set concrete plans for how they're going to get there. And just before I hand over to Bridget, I wanted to touch on a couple of sort of shorter term actions that businesses can take in line with our 5 campaigns. And if we can move on to the next slide, this sets out some of those. And these can be considered as steps businesses can take to help meet their net zero target as part of the race to zero. And there are a variety of options that fall under each campaign. I just wanted to touch on a couple of specific ones that I think are perhaps most relevant to Indonesian businesses. So on nature, we're very pleased that Indonesia now co-chairs the Forest, Agriculture and Commodity Trade Dialogue, which has been set up to ensure that global production and trade in commodities is sustainable, particularly looking at trade in commodities that can drive a lot of tropical deforestation. A really key part of this is that we want to work with producers to help improve livelihoods. And we obviously recognize that commodities like palm oil are crucial to Indonesia, but there's also an opportunity here to kind of really be at the forefront of sustainable supply chains, both from a government but also a business perspective. So we'd encourage all businesses to engage with the dialogue, and we can follow up with details of how to do so afterwards. On renewable energy as well is another key area. where businesses can commit to renewable power or through to improving their energy productivity through a couple of those initiatives listed there, and also demonstrate support for the coal phase out through the Powering Past Coal Alliance. And just finally, the other key thing that we're asking businesses to support with is by helping to advocate for a positive vision of the low carbon future, crucially across their supply chains, which is for a lot of big companies is where their biggest impact lies, but also with governments as well, demonstrating to governments that businesses want ambitious and clear climate action, and providing them with the confidence to go further, both in terms of setting stronger nationally determined contributions and 2030 targets, but also in specific areas where there's appetite for stronger action. And we'll just finish by saying that studies show that these are now the pro-growth options. Studies show that the energy transition path required to meet the Paris Agreement could increase global GDP by 2.5% by 2050 compared to current trajectories. And so there's in line with those, there's every reason for businesses to kind of advocate for changes to help get us there. And on that note, I will pause and hand over to Bridget.
Thank you, Alex. If we could move to the next slide. And hello, everybody. Ambassador Jenkins, esteemed colleagues, it's a pleasure to be with you today. So thank you so much for inviting me to share a little bit with you about the Race to Zero and the work of the climate champions. So this is about how business can play its part, and you will see that there is a lot of alignment between the work of the Climate Champions team and the UK presidency, as you would imagine. I'll waste no time and perhaps move on. I'm going to touch on three things today. First is how you can help us build momentum towards the COP and a successful summit at the end of 2021. Some companies ask us how they can attend the COP in Glasgow, so I'll touch briefly on that. And then also there are opportunities for you to take the COP out to where you are, and I'll mention that. Next slide, please. So the Race to Zero is one of the main campaigns of the Climate Champions. It's a UN-backed umbrella campaign to encourage all non-state actors to commit to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 at the very latest. And this is a campaign which allows any non-state actors, whether that's cities, states and regions, universities, financial institutions, or businesses, to get involved and to play their part. And of course, we know there's an ambition loop between the decisions and the policies and the legislation and regulations of government and the actions of non-state actors. So the Race to Zero really is about mitigation. There is a sibling campaign called Race to Resilience, which is about adaptation, but today's focus is the Race to Zero. Next slide, please. So there are a number of ways that businesses can join the race, and it really depends on what type of business you are and about the types of collaboration you may want to do once you have a commitment in order to deliver on it. And these are all hosted on a single website. There's a lot of links in these pages, which we can share with you afterwards, so you could go and have a look at more detail. But in short, if you are a large business, there are these 6 options on the left-hand side. The most obvious place to start for most large businesses is the one at the top, which is called the United Nations Business Ambition for 1.5 degrees. And that requires companies to have a CEO commit to getting to net zero by 2050 at the latest, and or set science-based targets for bold climate action in line with the 1.5 degrees in the midterm, with a strong focus on 2030, and then to deliver it through the Science-Based Targets Initiative. There are some others underneath. They all essentially have the same requirements, but the one which is the obvious preference for most companies is that one at the top. So that is where I would recommend companies interested in joining the race start. That's less true for financial services. Obviously, the nature of their business is quite different. And so there are a number of initiatives for either banks, the newly launched Net Zero Banking Alliance. I know Indonesia has a strong banking sector. Similarly, there is one for net zero asset owners and net zero asset managers. And both of those are ramping up in numbers very strongly, as the ambassador mentioned in his opening address. There are some particular entry points for companies if you happen to be in fashion or if you happen to be a winery, for example, probably less relevant for you. For B corporations, there is an entry point which is called the Climate Collective. Perhaps the other one that's most relevant for Indonesia is the ability for any small or micro business to also join the Race to Zero. For companies less than 500 people, we recognize that greenhouse gas accounting can be a bit burdensome, and so this gets to the spirit of the commitment, but without having to go to such measures in the accounting part of it. So in the blue box, it just mentions there that this is about science-based to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions, as we have all said this morning. It does cover all emissions scopes, so it's direct energy and electricity, but then all the other components of your value chain footprint as well, and a strong focus, as I mentioned, on the 2030 interim targets. And the procedural part of it, to make sure that people trust companies and all of us who are taking bold climate action, is to pledge, to plan, to proceed, and to publish, the 4 Ps. So this is actually have a plan in the public domain and report annually back on progress. So I spent quite a bit of time on that, but I think it's quite important to understand the main requirements of business, and we would love for many, many more Indonesian companies to be joining the race. Next slide, please. So I think we mentioned earlier, the numbers here are ramping up very quickly. This has been hugely popular. I think everybody knows what's at stake. There's now over 3,500 entities have joined the Race to Zero, and we monitor every week how many are joining. I would say it's somewhere between 10, 20, 30 companies every week are now joining the Race to Zero, and this is really positive news, but we do need many more, of course. And you can see that there's a large number of cities have joined. I know Jakarta is part of the C40 and is playing its part in it, and many of your regions also. So thank you for all the efforts thus far. Next page, please. I will touch briefly on what we call the breakthroughs. So as well as having a broad need for the private sector to move to net zero emissions, we know that actually a lot of the hard work will happen sector by sector, and that for some sectors, particularly hard to abate sectors that have got a heavy reliance on fossil fuels, this will be quite challenging. And so the Climate Champions team is focusing on how we might get to breakthroughs and find the new technologies that we need in order to decarbonize, with a focus on action in the first 10 years in order to really galvanize the level of momentum required. Next slide, please. And this is the theory, as you can see here, that every technological change happens on an S-curve. It starts slowly and then it becomes exponential. The job to do here is to scale where we know there are already existing technologies, renewable power, electric vehicles and mobility, for example, and where it's less obvious what the technology is to bring corporations together to collaborate to find solutions. So there are now some really forward-thinking collaborations and coalitions which are working on getting to zero steel, for example, getting to clean skies with sustainable aviation fuel or electric aviation. Also getting to zero coalition with shipping. There is all the possibility of having zero emissions shipping within 10 years. We just have to bring all the players along the value chain together to work on that level of innovation, as well as starting to really invest behind green hydrogen, carbon capture, usage and storage. So this is really to say that, of course, we want businesses to join the Race to Zero and reduce their own greenhouse gas emissions, but we recognise that there needs to be a new level of collaboration in each sector in order to decarbonise the economy as a whole. Thank you. Next slide. So many people ask us how you can come to the COP itself. There are a number of ways you can do this. The UK government is still accepting applications to become a sponsor for the COP, and there are some services and goods that are needed for the delivery of the COP, which it can be applied for and tendered for in the usual manner, and there are links in these pages. The the submission process to have space at the COP in Glasgow closed in March. And so now if you would like to be part of that, the best way to do it is to coordinate with the Marrakesh partners who already have space, and all the people who have been successful in their applications for space in the Glasgow arenas. And that will be announced, I think, next month. So look out for news on that. And that's the best way to actually physically come to Glasgow if you would like to do so. But you can also contribute to the technical discussions and provide business points of view through a process with the International Chambers of Commerce, who act as the focal point. And they are very keen to have more developing nations and small and medium enterprises take part. It's a really useful way for the negotiators to get business input during the 2 weeks of the convention itself. And also, if you are intending to come to Glasgow, then there is lots of information on this website here. It would be remiss of me not to mention that the COP is co-hosted with Italy, and there are 2 major events taking place in Italy. One is a convention, is a big event which involves youth, fabulous to have their points of view in it. And one of them is called the Pre-COP, which is a smaller number of countries who are inputting on key aspects of the negotiations ahead of the weeks, which will take place in November in Glasgow. And so there is the possibility for businesses to also participate in those events taking place in Italy. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the Marrakesh partnership. Many of you may be involved already with these organizations. And if you are and you want to come physically to the event, then this is the best place to go and to speak to those about how you can be involved. Next slide, please. So obviously we can't host everyone. We would like to, but we can't host everyone in Glasgow, and that might have rather large greenhouse gas footprint in its own right. And so we are also trying to encourage businesses and other organizations to bring the COP to where you are and take it out to the world. As has been mentioned before, it's going to require everyone to really heave to solve the climate crisis. And therefore, we would encourage you to use the events running up to the COP and the COP itself to educate your stakeholders, to showcase the great work you're doing and solutions that are available. And you can also live stream part of the proceedings and use that to kick off events that you might host in your own organization or in your local community. There is a Race to Zero toolkit available if you would like to host a Race to Zero endorsed event, and the details are all in here. So I think I'll leave it there for the moment and just hand back to Alex to give you some tips on how you can keep in touch with what's going on.
Thanks, Bridget. So just very quickly, we've got a kind of a range of we've got a newsletter, various social media channels. I think that the links are in a version of this presentation, so we can perhaps share that afterwards, and then people will have those available. And yes, please do sign up to make sure that you can stay in touch and get the latest updates.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Bridget. That was very comprehensive. I think from business perspective here in Indonesia, and I know that Chris Wren from Britcham is there and Oliver Richards from DIT, it'd be quite good to be able to socialise a lot of this information to businesses here, Chris and Oliver, and put it and get a process in place for regular updates. One of the questions I often get asked, Alex and Bridget, is Bridget was referring to participating in events at COP. Doesn't seem to be much information on the event structure, the agenda, the itinerary. When can we expect to see more information on that?
Shall I start, Bridget?
Yeah.
So you might have seen that we ran a expression of interest process for people to apply for spaces in the UK managed spaces. We're hoping within the next few weeks to be able to kind of release details of who has been successful, and then that should add a bit of clarity to kind of the program within the UK spaces. Yeah, I think we can expect that it will reflect some of the priorities we spoke about in our presentation, particularly around those 5 key campaign areas. And then, Bridget, would you know a little bit more about the kind of broader UN program as well?
I realised I was on mute, rookie error. So yes, the UK space application process ran through to March, as you mentioned. There is one for the UNFCCC, which I think opens in July, but that space is actually considerably more limited, I think. So that's Ainsley why we have set out in there the people to approach, the sorts of organisations to approach if companies do want to come and be represented in the green or the blue zone.
Okay, and the other interesting thing was perhaps localizing it, bringing COP to Indonesia. In some respects, that might be a lot more practical for a lot of businesses.
That's absolutely right. And that's why I think it's interesting that you can live stream a lot of the events into your own organizations or your communities. Or, for example, we know that there are a lot of companies who are thinking that they would launch their own Race to Zero delivery program in the business during the COP, because that seems a sensible launch platform, or having made their own Race to Zero commitment, host a supplier Race to Zero event to get their suppliers to help them and also participate, or do something in their local community that takes it broader. You know, we all have as businesses have important footprints in local areas. So there will be lots of material will be made available. I think that for those organizations and entities that are participating in Glasgow, many of them are looking at how they have a hybrid element. If anything, COVID has taught us we can do an awful lot via technology, and that means that we can make a lot of the information more available to people. So as Alex mentioned, on the final page, we didn't quite see it, but on the final page, we've put some specific links where you can keep in touch with that and be informed of what will be available as it will get shaped and finalized over the summer.
Okay, thank you. I think we should definitely look at that from an Indonesian perspective. Not that I don't want people to go to Glasgow. I grew up within walking distance of the site of COP, so I'm very happy more and more people want to visit my city. Now, I think let's get to the real nub of the matter, and let's focus on how businesses are responding to the Race to Zero challenge. And why is this subject so important to them and to Indonesia, and what action needs to be taken to support businesses more and accelerate progress? Today, I am very grateful to be joined by 4 senior executives, 2 representing global businesses and 2 representing Indonesian businesses, and all of whom are pivotal to driving change both within their organisation and in the wider business community. The 4 companies represented are Unilever, Standard Chartered, Forest Carbon, and Indika Energy. Each panelist will in turn give a short overview, and once their overviews are concluded, we'll progress to the Q&A. So to start with, I would like to introduce Arif Hurdaya of Unilever. And the reason we wanted to start with Unilever is that arguably of all the multinational companies, Unilever have one of the most developed and cohesive sustainability programs and Race to Net Zero programs globally. Arif has started his career in Unilever Indonesia and has been with the company for 24 years. He has held several senior positions both in Indonesia and outside of Indonesia, such as Singapore, London, and Malaysia, before returning to Indonesia in 2020 to serve as Chief Financial Officer. Last year, he also became a board member of Britam Indonesia. So, Arif, I would like to hand over to you, and thank you very much for participating today.
Thank you, Ainsley, and also the committee for this opportunity, and also for my fellow panelists who will certainly be highlighting the need for collective efforts from government and business and societies at large together to address this net zero commitment appropriately for this event after the Earth Day last week. I just would like to ask Indika for the slides that we'll be using. So for Unilever, while waiting for that, for Unilever, it is our long-standing commitment to sustainability, and started well from our founders more than 100 years ago, with the belief that when our brands tackle social and environmental issues, we will become a better business. For that context, if it's the next slide, last year in 2020, we reiterated our purpose, which is to make sustainable living commonplace, and launch Unilever Compass of 3 pillars, as you see in the slide, that sets out how we will deliver superior performance by being a purpose-led and a future-fit business. In that, our commitment to improve the health of the planet, where we focus, one of the most important topics of the day is the climate action. So as a headline and summary in short, Unilever has committed that we intend to reduce greenhouse gas emission ultimately to net zero across our value chain from sourcing to sales by 2039. And this can be achieved by our commitment to first achieving zero within our own operation by 2030. It is a bold and ambitious plan, as is 11 years ahead of the 2050 deadline outlined in the Paris Agreement. But our goals and path to deliver have been formally approved by Science-Based Target Initiatives. And earlier this year, we set out our Climate Action Transition Plan, which we will be put forward in the coming annual general meeting to shareholders on the 5th of May 2021 for a non-binding advisory vote. This is the very first time we put up this such event into our annual general meetings. For the next slide. So the real questions is about how do we plan to build pathway to achieve this such ambitious target. And this is the role of what we call our Climate Action Transition Plan. First, to start this journey, it is critical to understand the current baseline and the driver of our own carbon footprints. We have assessed that 65% of our carbon footprint are in indirect use-phase emission by consumers. But the 35 within our own influence of full value change, 35% from sourcing sales, is certainly our responsibility to be net zero as we reflect in the targets. And we identify this 35% carbon emission under our value change have a different drivers. For example, when we see our own operation from factories, office, and labs, is actually only about 1% of our carbon footprints. While when we have a bigger footprint in a sourcing from raw materials and packaging materials that combine 60% of that 35%, for example. So recognizing the driver of the carbon footprint is critical to define the pathway to net zero. The second is about how are we going to get there? And this is where we call with the circle of influence model. If you see on the left of the slides, there are circles that start with our own operations, and it goes into the next level, and then it's in a value change, our brand, and work to influence wider society. Achieving our net zero by 2039 targets will require a range of actions that can be categorized using the structural and progressive circle model in this slide. We need to start this with our own operation to achieve by 2030. This is a small share of our value chain emission, but represent a significant direct control. So as we achieve 100% renewable grid electricity target in 2020, our focus now is on a transition to renewable heat sources, increasing energy efficiency, and reducing refrigeration emission. For example, in Indonesia, we have reduced 86% lower from our baseline in 2008 for our gas emission through logistics and also our operation. We also have achieved procure 100% certified renewable technologies for our electricity. So that is them. And then the last slide, apologies for sharing this busy slide, but this is just to show at a glance of a collective actions could only then deliver the target and the model built together towards in order to achieve impact to net zero. It cannot be one, it cannot be two, it has to be many of what we could do to achieve this. And we believe that an integrative approach from our operation, supply chain, brands and product, multiple stakeholders collaboration, and the transparent governance is required to attain net zero by 2039. So the one block on the left are the area where we took from the circle and we define it to each of a small impactful actions that we define here as an element of programs. So as a closing, I think this is just the start of the bigger journey. Unilever globally and Unilever Indonesia here will always work jointly with all of our partners across our value chain, government, agencies, organizations, and industries at large to collectively drive lower levels of greenhouse gas emissions and toward net zero. First, our operation by 2030 and net zero by 2039 of a full value chain. So that's the sharing from Unilever, Ansley. I'll give it back to you.
Thank you very much, Pak Arif. I think if your goal is 2039, you're probably at the front of the race at the moment. So let's see if some other companies can catch up. Much has been made of the importance of finance in the race to zero. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Rino Dono Sapotro. Pak Doni, as he's better known, is the Vice Chairman for ASEAN and President Commissioner of Standard Chartered Bank Indonesia since 2019 and Vice Chairman of Maritime, Indonesia. As Vice Chairman for ASEAN, Pak Doni is responsible for driving execution of the bank's ASEAN strategy and providing governance oversight over the bank's footprints. He is also the bank's sustainability senior sponsor for ASEAN and all South Asia regions. So let's see if Pak Doni is going to bring some gifts in the form of finance to this discussion. Pak Doni, over to you.
Thank you, Ainsley, and also good afternoon to Ambassadors Jenkins and Boucheri. It's difficult to really beat actually what Unilever has done because they are indeed the pioneers that Arif has highlighted. But what has been said essentially, I think, convinced us that the transition to net zero carbon emissions is indeed a challenge of our generation. While waiting for the slides, I mean, as a UK global bank with focus on emerging markets, the challenge is especially evident in our footprints market of Asia, Africa, Middle East. Many of our markets are amongst the most vulnerable to climate change and most in need of funding to ensure that economic development can continue while the climate crisis is being addressed. However, these markets also represent some of the greatest opportunities to leapfrog to low carbon business models and renewable power. Now, we believe every organization in every sector has a critical role to play, and commitment to this agenda must be top of mind for all companies, public and private, large and small, and to succeed, they must undergo some major transformations. Speaking about transformation, next slide, please. Decarbonization is a key focus for Standard Chartered now, but we actually have started our sustainability journey some 20 plus years back, from developing environmental and social risk framework and governance, launching our sustainability aspirations and position statement as to what we can and cannot finance, to making commitment to finance about $75 billion for sustainable infrastructure and renewable energy by 2024. For the latter, last year alone, we have mobilized about $20 billion of funding for clean technology. We financed over 1.6 gigawatt of offshore wind projects in Taiwan, solar energy projects in India, Bangladesh, and Vietnam. And very recently, closer to home, we secured a mandate for a project finance for a consortium of Indonesian SOE with a sovereign energy developer.
Very well, is to collaborate well with specialized areas and specialists like yourself. To co-create sort of a building.
Sorry, I think actually we got a noise actually in the background.
Outcome, yeah. And what we hope in KKB.
Okay, let me continue. We just secured a mandate for a project finance for a consortium of Indonesian SOE with a sovereign energy developer to build a floating solar photovoltaic power plant in West Java, which will become the largest floating solar panel in Southeast Asia and the second largest in the world. Now, as you can see here on the net zero, essentially there are two commitments that we have made. First, we are committed to reaching net zero carbon emissions from our own operations by 2030. And second, given that we are a bank, the commitment to reaching net zero from our financing by 2050. I'll come back to this in a minute. In 2020, we reduced over our carbon footprint over 37% and increased energy provided by renewable sources by over 7%. Next page, please. During 2021, we started to develop the definition, methodologies, targets, and timelines to deliver net zero to our financing. So what it means is actually we measure, manage, and reduce the emissions related to not just our operations, but also the financing of our clients. To achieve the goals, we are developing sector-specific transition, as you can see here, frameworks for the most carbon-intensive industries within our portfolio. And starting with oil and gas and metals and mining, they will be published throughout the year. So we go actually from the probably more carbon-heavy sort of sectors within our portfolio first. Our dual objective here is to reduce our finance emissions and help our clients to transition. This is actually, I would underline this shortly. We fully understand that different sectors and regions will decarbonize at different rates. So horses for courses, essentially. And we want to ensure that capital flows to those clients who are the best performers, even those in traditionally high carbon intensive sectors. So what we're asking is that our clients in carbon intensive sectors to have a credible and public strategy to transition their business in line with the Paris Agreement. And we expect them to report their current greenhouse gas emissions, preferably in line with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, or TCFD. So we are asking our clients, same question, what we are asking ourselves. Do they have emission reduction targets? Do they have disclosure and emission measurement commitments? Do they have a credible climate transition plans? And whether that plans delivers actually on their targets. Where others see challenges, we see opportunities to partner with our clients who share our ambition and are ready to act. So for clients who are just starting on their journeys, we will provide sector-specific guidance on what our clients must do to prepare for a low-carbon future, tailored to regional considerations. For clients who have not yet launched their climate transition effort, we will help identify the most relevant transition levers, ensuring our clients create climate transition plans aligned to our own climate ambitions. Now, where clients are unable or unwilling to meet our requirements or show lack of progress to prepare for a net zero carbon future, we will consider this as a material risk factor and limit our relationship, ultimately leading to an exit, something which we have done. We have also established a number of key pillars, as you can see here, to accelerate the change. As an example, just to pick a few, building our expertise and credentials in specific technology for key cross-sector transition levers, such as electrification, hydrogen, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, and nature-based solutions. We will also play a key role in democratizing and mobilizing transition capital to emerging markets where it's needed the most, work with peers and policymakers to provide thought leadership and accelerate to net zero. Now, the position that we have actually, we are prime position to intermediate actually that flow of capital between the OECD, Europe, Americas, into the core footprints that we have in the emerging markets, Asia, Africa, and Middle East. Our commitments are getting more specific and backed by science-based targets because we believe in using data to guide our decisions. We've committed to report our own climate-related performance disclosures in line with SASB and the TCFD, as I mentioned earlier. We will continue to strengthen our financing criteria further and working with regulators and industry players on carbon markets and technology development. Example of this would be our participation recently as the founding member of the UN-convened Net Zero Banking Alliance, where we are working with industry peers to mobilize the trillions of dollars necessary to build a global zero-emission economy and deliver on the goals of the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. Just take probably actually 2-3 minutes. I thought actually since we're talking about the race to zero, would be interesting to share some insights from a research we conducted this year, so just a few months old, called Zeronomics, where we spoke to 250 senior leaders in large companies around the world and 100 investment specialists. The business leaders and investors we surveyed reveal how far companies have come on their net zero journey, what's blocking their path, and what might help them to move faster. So just a very brief summary. Companies are actually moving too slowly. 55% of the companies say they're not transitioning fast enough, and 78% of the investors say that most business leaders are failing to take the action needed to transition their company by 2050. The second point is main barrier for their net zero transition. No surprise there, as Ibu Sherry has highlighted for Indonesia, is the lack of finance. 85% of companies said high levels of investments are required, and they're having problems with the returns commercial viability of transitioning to net zero, where carbon-intensive industries and emerging markets are struggling the most with securing investors. I'd be very interested to hear from Arshad later on, actually, because that fits in actually energy sector actually in emerging market. So 64% of the senior executives believe the economics of operating as a net zero organization do not stack up for their company. Now, for ASEAN companies specifically, the Zeronomics report found that the biggest barrier to net zero transition is the lack of support from their organization's investors or shareholders, cited by 73% of the senior executives in ASEAN. Here we see that increased shareholder and investor support and inclusion of net zero as a key part of companies' directors' duties will be needed. There's also actually very, recent, because of the COVID-19, increasing sort of short-termism. Now, COVID has on one hand raised an alarm that climate change can have a real impact on us, but on the other hand, it has also caused companies worldwide to prioritize their short-term viability and survival. 85% of senior executives that we surveyed said that COVID-19 has delayed the transition, and it has forced many organizations to put net zero action on the back burner. Lastly, actually, next slide, please. How do we overcome the obstacles? We need to close the transition finance gap, no doubt. Financial institutions here actually play a very critical part. And as an example, we're working very closely with the Indonesian government in establishing an infrastructure for a carbon market in Indonesia and structuring a first carbon credit or natural capital backbone to help realize Indonesia's natural capital superpower potential. We're also exploring a direct bank lending prototype for upstream carbon credit producers, as Jeff knows, which we will open the financing faucet, hopefully, to these type of projects in the future. Now, so far, though, sustainable bonds are still the biggest source of funding, whether that's green, blue, or other types of sustainability-linked bonds. And in this space, we have been actively involved in a number of government of Indonesia's issuances of green sukuk, pandemic bonds, and global bonds. We're also seeing another trend of electric vehicles end-to-end, so from upstream to downstream, particularly for Indonesia. We are advising and supporting our global clients in their expansions of EV into Indonesia, as well as actually the local companies who wants to transition from petrol and diesel vehicles to EVs. Novel sustainable financing arrangements like this are driving innovation in the technology that will help us transition towards a net zero future. We also need to have a standardization of global measurement and disclosure framework. To support the private sector, we think that the governments should integrate environmental objectives with a wider policy framework. We have made some progress in Indonesia. OJK has launched their Sustainable Finance Roadmap Phase 2 for 2021 to 2025, which definitely will provide the regulatory framework for Indonesian financial industry, while, as many of us know, our Ministry of Environment and Forestry is finalizing Indonesia's first ever carbon economic value regulation, which will control the carbon markets here. Now, just a little bit more on the carbon market. As more developed carbon markets are now in the horizon, we also need to pay attention on carbon offsets, is that offsetting cannot detract us from reducing the emissions. In the hierarchy of in order of priority to remains essentially to reduce, report, and offset. But still, offsets are necessary for achieving climate commitments. They can finance immediate progress by channeling capital into nature-based and new technology solutions. We know that deforestation is responsible for 15% of global GHG emissions. So stopping that now is of huge importance. We need to make net zero transition commercially viable. So there's a combination of things. I think Pak Arif in Unilever actually has highlighted that. We can do it actually by increasing operational efficiency and cost saving from sustainable practices. Investors actually also view that an effective, in our survey, effective global carbon tax based on carbon price that reflects the true cost of climate change will help to accelerate the transition. As it happens, our group CEO, Bill Winters, is chairing a global task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets, which is a private sector-led initiative to scale voluntary carbon markets. This will help to put a price on carbon credit generation to incentivize companies further. Pressure from supply chain, I think Pak Arif has explained that. This will help significantly in creating actually that impact actually to the ecosystem of any of the companies and help precipitate adoption of the net zero. Lastly, we must act now and we must act together. Companies, consumers, governments, regulators, and the finance industry must collaborate to develop sustainable solutions, technologies, and infrastructure. Good intentions are the first step towards sustainable change, and now is the time to translate strong words into bold action. Thanks, and back to you, Ainsley.
Thank you, Donny, for that very comprehensive overview. We might get back to a couple of the subjects later, particularly financing or transition. I mean, if I look at some of the sectors you're looking at, like shipping and energy, if it takes shipping, it's very difficult for the world's shipping fleets to convert to say, hydrogen at the moment. So how to finance the acceleration of decommissioning of some of these assets, and it could be the same for, say, coal-fired power plants and what have you. Now what I'd like to do is to focus on a couple of Indonesian companies, and firstly I would like to, there's been some talk today on nature-based solutions, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Jeffrey Chatelli of Forest Carbon. It's an Indonesian-based company that is rapidly gaining international acclaim. Jeffrey is a conservation scientist who has advised major corporations, multilateral institutions, and international environmental organizations on conservation finance, forestry, and sustainability over 10 years. In 2010, he became a partner and director at PT Forest Carbon, an environmental consultancy focused on Southeast Asia. During his tenure at Forest Carbon, he has advised a wide range of clients, including Deloitte, the EU, UNDP, USAID, EIZ, and SNV. I'm not quite sure who SNV is, and I should have checked earlier. But Jeffrey, time is marching on, so just hand over to you right now.
Great. Thank you, Ainsley, for the introduction. For everyone, Forest Carbon is an Indonesia-based company that restores and protects tropical forests. We fund and manage large-scale forest restoration and conservation assets, working with our Indonesian partners. And as an impact-driven enterprise, our mission is to implement projects that protect over 250,000 hectares of peatlands and mangroves in Indonesia by 2025. You know, in terms of our track record in the country, in 2017, working with our partner Global Alam Lestari, we secured a $6 million investment for the Sumatra Merang peatland project to restore more than 23,000 hectares of degraded peatland forest in South Sumatra. For this investment, we worked with the London-based Althelia Climate Fund to launch the project, which has demonstrated that a market-based approach to forest restoration can be successful commercially and also effectively finance fire prevention, peatland restoration, protection of habitat for endangered species like the Sumatran tiger, and build out rural community development programs that are critical for building rural economies across the country. To date for that project, we've produced over 1.7 million carbon offsets and have secured over $14 million in sales with major clients such as London's Heathrow Airport, UK-based engineering firm Mott MacDonald, along with other international companies that have made net zero commitments, such as Microsoft, Chanel, L'Oreal, BMW, and Bayer Pharmaceuticals. Building on this success, Forest Carbon has now issued green bonds to finance new forest restoration projects in Indonesia. AXA, the global insurance company, which is also a shareholder in Forest Carbon, has subscribed to the first $9 million in project bonds that we are now using to expand our pipeline of new projects to secure ecosystems in Indonesia that are vulnerable to fire, biodiversity loss, and industrial conversion. And ultimately, we see the race to net zero as a critical foundation that will support the growth of this emerging sector that we call nature-based solutions and help build out Indonesia's economy. And we also see it as something that will truly support the country to meet its NDC targets. So that's it for my introduction, and look forward to the questions in the panel later.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey, and thank you for being so short and concise. It helped us catch up a little bit in time. And it's great to hear that an Indonesian company has been able to tap into the international finance markets to pursue their programs here in Indonesia. Finally, but not least, I would like to now move to a senior executive from the energy sector, Arshad Rashid of Indika Energy, a company I know very well. Arshad Rashid is currently serving as the President Director of PT Indika Energy, Indonesia's leading integrated energy company. Within Indika Energy, He held the chairmanship and board position in many companies such as PT Tripatra Engineers and Contractors, PT Petrosi, PT Mitra Bahatera Sagara Sajati. Rashid is the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leader in 2011, and in 2012, he was awarded the Best Executive in Indonesia from Asia Money. So my great pleasure to beam Pak Arshad in, I think from Pontianak. Pak Arshad, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ansley, and yeah, please bear with me if the internet connection is not that well. So I'm away from home, but just let me have some greetings to Her Majesty the Ambassador Bapak Owen Jenkins, and just now to Indonesian COP26 envoy Ibu Sherry Nur Salim, and also the COP26 delegation, Alex and Bridget, and also, of course, my fellow panelists, Pak Arif, Pak Rino, and of course, Pak Jeffrey. Again, very good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor for me to be here today. I would like to share with you about what I say as a journey of Indika Energy to a net zero. Next slide, please. Thank you. In Indika Energy, I mean, last year we've turned 20 years old. So we call ourselves young and old because some of our companies actually exist for already more than 50 years. And because we grew through acquisition, M&As, and through mostly in inorganic ways, but also in the organic ways. And so what you see in the slide is how Indika Energy people know today and what will be the future of Indika Energy. And Indika Energy today is very focused on energy resources, services, and also infrastructures. But we are reinventing ourselves. We are reinventing ourselves. We are in the process of reinvention. We are revisiting our vision. We are revisiting our mission. We are looking at various new strategies. Some of it is, for example, the first theme of our strategy is logistic and infrastructures. And we have minerals, we have nature's based solution businesses where we are going towards now with investing ourselves. We've committed about $500 million with our partners, the RISE Fund actually to invest in renewables, particularly in solar energy. And we've just established a company for electric vehicles, and we are moving towards other green economies. We also will have our strategy in digital ventures, and of course others. So we are actually really making ourselves reinventing ourselves, and we are now also supporting the utilization of advanced technology to drive sustainability, which we regard as a very essential element in conducting our operation. We aim to be a strong environmental, social, and governance implementer, as an ESG implementer, by protecting the environments, advancing social impact, and applying good corporate governance. Next slide, please. So what we see here is the journey for us. Today, we've committed ourselves to a net zero emission by 2050, but this is something that we'll review every year. And what we want to be is part of this race, the race to the net zero. And we would like to win this race. So every year we will be evaluating ourselves, and we'll be making plans towards a direction where we can actually be a net zero emission earlier than 2050. But this is a journey, and so this is the path that we are going forwards. But first thing first, what we have actually committed to our investors is that by 2025, at least 50% of our revenues will be a non-coal based revenues. And that's a commitment that we just did last year when we actually issued our last global bonds. which I thanks also to Standard Chartered as a part of who actually assisted us in actually doing these global bonds. And so we are committed with the net zero directions and will improve it every year. We are also develop a 2025 target on our ESG metrics for the group. So in the environmental, we want to reduce our GHG emission by 10% and energy usage by 12%. And in social, one of our focus is on improving occupational health and safety. And it's part of our relentless pursuit of sustained zero incidence rate for a long term. And in governance, as for example, as of last year, we've actually we have now ISO anti-bribery, which issued for the whole group within Indika Energy, and now, for example, we are ensuring standardized compliance documents and incorporating ESG parameters into our BOD and BOC KPIs. And again, we are making ESG part of our value systems. So we are instilling that values. We are not just saying it as a per se of ESG, but we want to live ESG and be part as a corporate citizens of the world, and that's what we want to do. Next slide, please. There are numbers just of key initiatives that we have actually we are driving. Just some of the examples that we have on the environmental is about the 13,000 hectares of this river flow area that we are replanting, and then we have also a process of land reforestation, fuel efficiencies. We are creating a water treatment plant. We are making even in our current so-called coal mine, we are doing solar for our base camps, offices, and we will have solar energy within the whole operations of our operations. We have, as I mentioned before, we are launching a pilot on electric vehicles. And this is part of our business, but also part of how we want to do business in the future. And socially, we have all created Eco Park. We have, contributed to access to clean water. We are helping on the COVID-19 situation. We have actually developed a laboratorium to actually now the largest PCR laboratorium in Indonesia with around 5,000 capacity per day, and we are moving this direction towards a genomic sequencing to be part of a health prevention initiative, working together with the Indonesian government, and of course on the government itself. As I've mentioned, we have created sustainable committee, and it's all chaired by independent board members, and we're making sure that we are complying to all the anti-governance, which is basically making sure that we are in improving our governance. And so that's how we are. And again, we want to make sure that we are committed to the ESG, and we at Indika Energy, we have very long understood this, and it has inspired us to actually continuously strive to minimize the impact that we make as we transition to a low carbon trajectory. It is our commitment. It is something to aim for, and it is again integral part of our values. So perhaps that's for me, Ansley, to start this as introduction of Indika Energy and how Indika Energy is preventing ourselves and participating in this race to zero emission.
Thank
to you,
Ansley,
thank
you very
you.
much, Pak Arshad. Just a quick note to Indika. I know we've only got 4 or 5 minutes left on the official timeline, but if you could drop me a note to indicate how much additional time, if any, we might have for Q&A. I've got a question for Pak Arshad. It's great to see a company like Indika setting the targets for net zero by 2050, and you come from an industry where it must be quite difficult to meet these targets. Where originally, obviously, with the coal and the power plants and what have you. Can I ask, is there, as part of that of transition, is there any pressure to accelerate the decommissioning of existing assets like coal-fired power plants or even coal mines? And secondly, if so, have you come across any interesting financing programs that can help with such transition?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I mean, as you know, it is a very tough, right? For us, we are mining and fossil fuel, right? And investors are really increasingly scrutinizing our situation. That's why, and also not only investors, but also regulators, and also, of course, our stakeholders, even our own employee. And actually, and you can say at home, it's my children. So basically, but what's happening here, the pressure is very high. But the way we look at it is that we've been always been looking at sustainability as part of our values. I mean, even when we talk about coal, when we talk about power plants, we were actually the first company in Indonesia to use technology of supercritical in 2012, and actually, you know, a few years ago to actually also improve our technology in our power plant with supercritical. Of course, at the same time, we are actually, as we said, we are moving away from coal. And from last year, for example, in our global bonds, a lot of our investors, of course, asked about our ESG, and we've explained. And thankfully, I mean, we've been very, from the very beginning, we've been very much care about sustainability. And so we can be able to see what we have done in environmentally, in socially, and also in our governance situation. So that's why the global bond investors have actually, supported us in all the bonds and even on the last bonds. But again, the pressure is getting higher, of course, and it is making. We can see that the futures of financing or even investment in the so-called non-ESG or the non-sustainable businesses will be very, very tough, right? So again, what we are doing right now is we have committed to a 50% non-coal in our revenues, and also we are looking now also, I mean, working with you, I mean, with for example, with Standard Chartered banks, and looking at green bonds for the futures, and this is something that I think is what the world today. And we need to in part of our new values called agility. So we have to be agile, and so this is the part that we need to adopt and be innovative, and really we need to move towards this zero carbon. Thank you.
Thank you, Arshad. Donny, would you like to comment, because it's an issue that comes up quite a lot in terms of transitioning, particularly what to do with existing assets and whether or not there's a way to accelerate transition by either converting or decommissioning.
Yeah, and I think actually there's no kind of actually silver bullet actually in terms of the answers to that, because and I think Indika is really leading the way. Actually, I would really like to compliment Arshad and the team that in making that transition, and I suppose actually all the key stakeholders would have to support such a company to transition pretty smoothly into net zero, starting actually from the investors, the shareholders, the financial sort of industries, and also actually the leaders of the companies, because actually that's really very important. All of it actually would require certain, as you say, actually retiring existing assets, which may not have reached the end of its tenure. It's a big, massive undertaking. Now, technology innovations actually is very important actually to help in that respects. And what Jeff actually had highlighted, I mean, introducing carbon credits is another potential stream of revenue to help transition actually, or retiring actually of existing assets into the new one, which is more sort of sustainable, may help. So it is indeed a combination of all the factors. And we also recognize the geographical sort of differences in terms of circumstances and the pace in the embracing of the net zero.
Thank you, Donny. Donny, you mentioned there carbon credits as one potential additional source of revenue to help with this. The carbon credit market for a lot of laymen is actually quite difficult to understand. And there's been some reports recently. I saw something in Bloomberg about the Nature Conservancy in the US and double dipping of carbon credits. I'd like to ask Jeff, in terms of the carbon credit market, is there more that needs to be done here in Indonesia in terms of regulation, making it more transparent and adding more credibility to it?
Sure. You know, I think one thing to mention when we're looking at, you know, the nature-based solutions sector is that Indonesia really has become, you know, one of the leaders regionally in ASEAN as well. Over the past 10 years, there have been 4 projects that have been developed using international standards, which, you know, are very rigorous from a methodological perspective. And these projects cover over 250,000 hectares of land in Indonesia, producing over 10 million carbon offsets per year. So when we look at sort of the policy environment, Indonesia already has a number of special licenses within the Ministry of Forestry and Environment that allow companies to develop these projects and produce carbon credits and sell them into international markets. I think one of the things that, you know, would be good for the sector is that we see, you know, more support to companies that have industrial forestry licenses and provide them, you know, with a more clear pathway for generating credits within, you know, their portfolio. So I think as we see more companies that have plantation forests or even areas classified for palm oil, this would allow the sector to expand and also flourish.
Thank you, Jeff. Arif, I'm intrigued in terms of Unilever's net zero targets. Do carbon credits or plastic credits or any of these mechanisms feature in your plans at all?
So we acknowledge about these internationally recognized verified carbon credits that can be generated, and as well as this can provide an income of streams for farmers, for examples. But for Unilever, I think the next decade, our focus will be on a science-based emission reduction pathways, Ansley, which is about complemented with carbon removal with all visible reduction as our key focus before we go to offsetting. So that is where the priority, because we believe that will force the accelerations of efforts to get to it. Now, after that, then will be a different situations after all the efforts we put.
And does that mean, Arif, that you're putting more into R&D?
That's correct. So in our R&D today, for example, it's coming from products, which is one of the elements where we will do more concentration and more compaction. And in fact, we can further reduce emission from product formulation by transitioning away from fossil fuels as a feedstock for our chemical. So just about 2 weeks ago, we launched a laundry capsule where we capture the carbon from a recycled carbon rather than the fossil fuel carbon. So continuous effort of making our own operation as well as our products is currently the next focus that we will put our efforts to reduce and towards net zero, NT.
Okay, thank you. Just one quick question for you. You talked about bringing in your supply chain and working with your supply chain to achieve net zero. Does this include your banks? So do you look at banks that have committed to net zero and ones that haven't? And just when you're looking at financing, are you looking at extending that criteria to your service providers?
Yeah, definitely, because we're looking at all across partners and where it comes to it. So I think we have challenges first on an operational physical value chain, as well as, I think, financing value chain. So both are the whole aspects where I think that can make the best effort to achieve the net zero emissions at the end.
Thank you. Just on that subject, to a certain extent, a few days ago, when Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, launched that Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, I was looking at the list of banks, Donny, obviously your bank's there, but 40 or 50 international banks. Chinese and Indonesian banks were conspicuous by their absence, and not many from ASEAN. Why do you think that is? And in your dialogues with your banking colleagues in Indonesia, are we likely to see an Indonesian bank join such an initiative in the near future?
Okay, the second one, I think actually, Ainsley, absolutely. Actually, we would love to see actually more banks from ASEAN, particularly Indonesia, actually to join that initiative. And I think actually, to be quite honest, it's just a matter of time. Again, as we mentioned about how we help our clients transition, geographies, regions sort of play a factor here. It's horses for courses. The differences in terms of the circumstances, in terms of the pace actually that they can pick up, but all actually would have to lead to that. So I believe it's just a matter of time. Locally in Indonesia, OJK with that Sustainable Finance Roadmap Phase 2, 2021-25, actually will provide that strong impetus for Indonesian banking industry to move towards that direction, no doubt.
Thank you. A quick one for Pak Arshad. About a month ago, Donny and I participated in a discussion with the ambassador and Sheeta Kamdani from Kadin. And one of the issues that came out of that discussion was the need to promote the net zero initiative to more of the medium-sized enterprises in Indonesia and the smaller companies in Indonesia. And I know it's one of Ari's colleagues has also mentioned that while the larger companies are embracing this, the next level down is maybe not moving as quickly as people would like. Do you think that we can do more collectively to engage with the next level down, the medium-sized enterprises?
Ainsley, yeah, no, just why I'm actually in Pontianak now is actually I'm nominating myself as one of the nomination for the chairman of Kadin for 2021 to 2026, right? And then part of our vision and mission is actually first is to how Kadin can be playing more roles in actually engaging and also pushing or creating the SMEs, right? And that part of it is part of my initiative actually, or my pillar of my vision and mission in Kadin is actually how we can engage the so-called SME and how do we create what we call innovation hub, or in Bahasa we call it warung inovasi, where they're actually not only educating the SME towards, let's say, digitalization, how to be bankable, right? But also putting the values of sustainability. I think it's all about educating. I think everyone wants to be part of this race to zero. And so I think this should be part of what Kadin be in actually educating the SMEs. And so that the futures of all the entrepreneurs, whether social entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs, how can they be part of this, and they know what there is, there's a race to this, and so that everyone will be participating. And so I do believe the SMEs in Indonesia will play a much more greater role in this race, Ainsley. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak Arshad. I see the time is now coming up for 3:45, so we've exceeded our allotted time by almost quarter of an hour. That was a very positive note to end on, and if Kadin is going down that route in the future, I'm no longer a Britcham board member, but I'm sure Pat Donny and Pat Arif would agree that Britcham would be a very willing partner in any initiative like that.
Indeed, and Pak Arshad, may we wish you all the very best actually for the current leadership, as you mentioned.
Thank you, and all the best.
All the best.
Thank you, best of luck. Thank you
So
very much.
I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Pat Arshad, Pat Donny, Jeffrey, and Pat Arif. Thank you very much for your contributions. This is the first of hopefully many dialogues. I know that Pat Donny and I have spoken about the next step in this dialogue, perhaps focusing more on practical financial solutions for companies, and also maybe doing something more on the technology side as well, to bring UK technology to more to the forefront of Indonesian companies. So keep your eyes open. We hope to develop these dialogues in the future. And I'm very interested actually in what Bridget and Alex were saying about the possibility of bringing COP26 to the doorstep of people here in Indonesia. And I think that's something that we should look at. I would like to thank the embassy for setting all this up. So particularly to Indika for all the coordination. And to the ambassador for all his support. And I look forward to seeing many of the participants again in the future. There's some questions there which we will answer. We'll get back to people on. Indika, have you got any last comments you would like to make before we all sign off? You're in mute.
Oops, sorry. Yeah. So no, I think we have been having a very interactive and interesting discussions. I hope this discussion have also given concrete actions that can be taken by companies that haven't joined the Race to Zero. So this is just a start, and hopefully we can continue the discussion after this. And so thanks for Pak Donny, Jeffrey, Pak Arif, Pak Arshad, and you, Ansley, and also Bridget and Alex. Thanks for the presentation. I think that's very helpful. So yeah, I think that's all for me. And thank you for all the attendees who joined the initiative today.
Okay, thank you. Look forward to seeing you all soon.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Brit. Thank you, the embassy and everyone. Stay healthy. Bye.
Thank you, Ainsley.